April 1945. A bruised sky hangs low over a battered Allied airfield.
In the chilly morning haze, the ground is churned by muddy boot prints and crisscrossed by rows of heavy trucks. Beyond the wire, rows of wooden barracks lean against the wind, the
boundaries of a POW camp holding scores of German women. Most have endured weeks or months of captivity, their uniforms faded, their hands calloused, faces taut with the strain of survival and uncertainty. They are nurses, former typists, clerks, auxiliaries, many swept up in the chaos of retreat as the Nazi regime collapsed around them.
Within sight of the camp fence, an engine roars across the sky. The German prisoners pose their morning routine, some clutching thin ration tins, others standing near the laundry line strung between barracks. The aircraft sweeps low of vintage. Transport, mottled by oil and grime, but carrying the unmistakable insignia of the Allies.
Its wheels play as it lands, skidding across the mud-strewn airstrip until it comes to a rumbling halt.
The side hatch swings open, and out stride a group of women, heads high, movements sharp with purpose. The German POWs stare, jawline set, expecting male officers or supply crew. Instead, what steps down shocks them into silence. Allied women pilots dressed in full flight suits, boots laced, parachute packs unbuckled, goggles pulled onto foreheads. The scene is quiet but crackling with tension.
For those German women behind wire, the image sears into memory a living tableau of contradiction and challenge. Some blink, convinced at first they've misread the uniforms.
Others nudge each other, whispering in urgent German. Sind die es wirklich Pilotinnen?
Is this possible? The pilots speak briefly with ground crew, faces visible in the mist, defiant and assured. They are Americans and British, members of the WASP and ATA, ferrying new aircraft for combat or supply runs.
Their flight suits hang with maps, gloves, radios, patches stitched against months of wind and danger for the German POWs. The very sight ruptures deep beliefs. They had grown up in a world where war was a man's terrain, a crucible of uniform, and sacrifice divided sharply along gender lines. Even as conscripted auxiliaries, they were taught to keep to the shadows, to patch wounds or file reports, never to take command of machines that slice through sky and certainty.
But here, in the mad and cold, women hold that command, stride with authority, converse easily with ground crews, assist cargo, and negotiate the transfer of supplies. The guards notice the stir in the camp yard.
Whispers rise in intensity, some of disbelief, some of resentment, and a few of awe.
A young German nurse, recently arrived from Berlin, grips the edge of her blanket. Her own wartime memories flash of air raids endured in cellars. Pilots glimpsed only as distant silhouettes against searchlight beams.
She stares, unable to reconcile the spectacle. Women in flight suits, undaunted, unpunished, and clearly respected by every man in sight. Across the fence, the pilots move with the practiced ease of those who have flown dozens of missions. Their boots dig into the soft earth as they hoist gear, load crates, chat with mechanics in short, clipped English. One British pilot, her hair neat beneath a regulation cap, gestures for a clipboard and reviews flight logs with the confidence born of constant exposure to risk. An American, tall and sunburned from long runs into southern France, opens a ration package, sharing chocolate and coffee with ground staff. The POWs watch every gesture, every exchange, trying to decipher what it all means, how the outer world has shifted, and why the old rules no longer apply. In this small, crucial moment, the impact reverberates. For some onlookers, pride flares a defensive counterpoint to the shock of spectacle. That is for others, not us, but for most, the encounter cracks open curiosity, even hunger for understanding. Did these women fly in battle? Did they carry bombs, navigate through storms, evade enemy fire?
Did their families know? Who taught them? Who allowed it? And what waited for them after their missions were done? A Red Cross staffer, herself a veteran of supply drops across the Ardennes, is stationed at the edge of the camp.
She observes the reactions, both subtle and overt.
Her own records, later submitted as part of Allied psychological reports, note the unanticipated effect such events have on the morale and worldview of female prisoners. Many POWs expressed disbelief, she writes. Others asked for stories, news, and proof. A handful cried, not from envy, but from the sudden recognition that history might be wider than the fate they endured. A day later, rumors about the women pilots saturate the camp. Guards are peppered with questions.
A senior German matron,
steeled by years in military hospitals, wonders aloud whether this is allied propaganda or the vanguard of social change.
Skepticism is strong at first. A few POWs snicker or dismiss the pilots, retreating to familiar narratives about the enemy. Surely they just deliver lunch. Surely those uniforms are for show. But slow evidence builds. Flight logs exchanged.
Technical manuals shared. Allied officers treating women pilots with open respect.
The weather turns wet, and the routine resumes. Yet the shock lingers. POWs gather in tight circles in the evening, recalling each detail, each embroidered patch, each minute gesture of command.
Some wish to write home and tell sisters or daughters about what they've seen. Others spin imagined futures, struggling to locate themselves within the altitude and ambition of a world at war. The next supply run sees a group of American wasp pilots enter the camp gates, permitted unprecedentedly to speak with medical staff.
They share stories of ferrying Thunderbolts and Mustangs, of training in the Arizona sun, of a wartime sky full of risk and possibility. German nurses and clerks push against old boundaries, asking timid questions, pressing for training details and anecdotes. In these exchanges, camaraderie flickers not through shared nation, but through a silent recognition that the rules of gender and war are not eternal. Against the backdrop of the camp's daily grind, meals rationed, logbooks tallied, the ever-present
tension between order and boredom, the vision of women pilots haunts and animates many.
The shadow of uniform and the promise of flight hang as contradictory emblems in memory. Even those most resistant cannot entirely turn away. The spectacle is too sharp, too foreign, and too deep to ignore. Thus, the story of the stunned German
female POWs, confronted by the reality of women pilots in flight suits, begins not as anecdote, but as rupture, a moment when history widens in a blink, and the future, for a second, hints at freedom written in contrails and blueprints.
The sense of astonishment inside that POW camp was not born in isolation. It was the result of two worlds clashing, one of rigid gender tradition, the other of experimentation and necessity bred by total war. German female prisoners, many in their 20s or early 30s, had entered service with the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe primarily as nurses, typists, clerks, radio operators, and medical auxiliaries. Almost none had dreamed of flying, let alone in uniform, and certainly not as pilots. In Nazi Germany, the social order had been ironclad. Women were praised for sacrifice and submission, relegated to the home front or to support roles, their patriotism measured in quiet endurance rather than command. The Allies, for all their own biases, were different. Desperation and innovation, especially by the third and fourth years of the war, had pushed Britain, America, and the Soviet Union to test the boundaries of what women could do. The British
air transport auxiliary filled with women from many nations had flown over 1,100,000 miles by 1944, ferrying Spitfires, Hurricanes, and bombers from factories to frontline airfields. America's Women Air Force Service pilots WASP delivered more than 12,000 planes between 1942 and 1944, overcoming prejudice and skepticism by sheer competence and courage.
Even in the Soviet Union, the Night Witches, the 588th Night
Bomber Regiment terrified German forces with their daring moonlit raids in rickety biplanes. Yet in the German camp that spring, few among the POWs had ever heard such stories in detail.
Propaganda painted enemy women as frivolous or dangerous, too liberated by half, untrustworthy in their ambitions.
Official documents, party newspapers, and military instruction all underscored. A woman's highest call was sacrifice in silence, endurance in crisis, not leadership or risk.
But total war played by its own rules. As the Allies pressed toward Berlin and the Reich crumbled, the myth of female passivity was pierced by radio reports and fragments of rumor. In some parts of Germany, captured Red Army flyers were identified as women.
Scattered newsreels rarely shown in full flashed images of tough, mud-spattered women in British or American uniforms, tuning engines or strapping into cockpits.
Still, most German women in captivity clung to old certainties. The shock was all the greater when reality landed, quite literally, on the field next door. Inside the barracks, each day spun out in strict routine, roll calls before dawn, often in biting cold, followed by hours spent in cleaning, cooking, or tending the sick. For some, the only work was waiting, watching windows, memorizing the rhythm of guard movements, marking time by the arrival of meals or camp patrols. The monotony was sharpest for those accustomed to work or danger.
Nurses, especially, chafed at inactivity, haunted by memories of crowded emergency rooms and blooded field tents.
Conversations circled endlessly among the prisoners.
Rumors about the outside world, the end of the war, and the fate of families back home mingled with stories from new arrivals.
What news they had was fragmentary, a guard's offhand comment, contraband notes smuggled in with Red Cross parcels, rare glimpses of Allied newspapers. Word of the women pilots spread fast.
Within days, everyone knew. Not only had women landed planes at the airfield, but at least 2 had walked the perimeter with American officers, had carried themselves as if the fences were invisible and the men around them equals. The camp's rules,
formal and informal, were enforced by both guards and a shifting hierarchy of senior German POWs.
While punishment was now far less severe than in the early months, order was enforced through routine, a habit born of discipline, now doubled by the uncertainty of defeat. Yet, beneath the surface, psychological tension simmered. Was the world they knew truly over?
Would the wars end in freedom or only more confusion? Did the Allies really believe what they showed, that women could fight, command, and choose danger for themselves?
At night, in the packed dormitories, the women divided into clusters: nurses, clerks, older and younger, those resigned to fate and those restless for change.
Younger women especially fell into whispered debates. What was it like, flying high above the mud, seeing battlefields and ruined cities as patterns sagging beneath the thin blue sky? Could anyone have become pilots, if only things were different?
The Allied side likewise wrestled with the consequences of these encounters.
In Red Cross and military reports, officers debated whether allowing female pilots near the camps was wise. Some supported it as a morale boost, a clear sign of Allied innovation and gender equality. Others worried it might spark unrest, envy, or even resentment among the prisoners. Ultimately, need prevailed. Pilots were desperately required.
And the symbolism, once unleashed, could not easily be turned away. Or as the story of the women pilots became myth and rumor,
the lines between enemy and inspiration began to blur. Across age and background, German POWs found themselves recalibrating their ideas not just of defeat and survival, but of what was possible beyond the barbed wire.
For a generation raised on stories of duty and shadow, the sight of women in flight suits offered something new, a glimpse,
if only for a moment, of a world where courage and command were measured not by gender, but by the willingness to face the unknown. In the days following the appearance of the women pilots,
the impact rippled quietly through the routine of the camp.
The German female POWs felt this shock as something more complex than a jolt of envy or pride.
It unsettled their identities and raised questions they had never had permission to ask. They began to watch the sky with new attention.
It was not just the planes themselves, but the idea of living without a script, of moving past inherited boundaries. For nurses and orderlies, the stanzas of their day's roll call, cleaning, tending wounds, were now punctuated by sudden bursts of speculation. Conversations at breakfast became sharper, filled with pointed questions.
Could women truly be trusted with such machines? Was this what victory looked like for the Allies? A world upended so thoroughly that even the sky could be claimed?
Some prisoners, older and more resolute, clung to what they had been taught, that war belonged to men, that order depended on hierarchy.
They reminded others of duty, of discipline, of the old certainties drawn as tightly as the fence around their barracks. But even these voices seemed less certain, their authority eroded by the undeniable spectacle across the wire. Among the younger POWs, hope crept in as a dangerous luxury.
Late at night, when only the sound of distant engines and the murmur of guards remained, bits of poetry and diary pages were passed hand to hand.
They wrote not only of food and family, but of horizons, of wanting to escape not just captivity, but the boundaries of expectation. Allied officers, aware of the unrest and curiosity stirred up by their pilots,
alternated between cautious amusement and pragmatic unconcern.
They realized the presence of the women pilots did more than ferry planes.
It ferried ideas, planted seeds of unrest, of possibility, in soil prepared by loss. The pilots themselves seemed aware of their own power.
In brief, sanctioned encounters while waiting for fuel or paperwork, some offered reassurances and anecdotes.
A few German nurses risked a question, voice trembling, asking about training, about the fear of the first solo flight.
Pilots responded plainly, describing the nerves, the danger, the feeling of opening a sky close to their mothers. These moments took on outsized importance within the camp, feeding the rumors, igniting quiet dreams. In practical terms, the spectacle had its own logic. The Allies needed every capable flyer, every mind willing to brave the logistical gauntlet of wartime aviation. Women had proved themselves not only in ferry missions and supply flights, but sometimes in direct combat, especially in the East. Their uniforms, their presence at the field, were not tokens but the visible outcome of necessity and courage.
POWs, accustomed to being told what was possible,
found themselves witnesses to a larger world where command was open,
where talent could overstretch silence, where the rules were written new. For the Germans, the experience carried bitter medicine and subtle promise. Some POWs, hardened by defeat, muttered darkly about propaganda and morale, about the humiliation of seeing women stride where their own rights had always been in question. But the more honest voices, those spoken in privacy or scribbled in diaries destined for Red Cross mailbags, reflected real change. Suddenly, the idea of one's own future seemed both less certain and more open. The past was no longer the guide. The future could be chosen, even if only imagined beneath hungry blankets. The reality of war itself, a teacher more persistent than any instructor, was laid bare in these encounters. In one moment, the camp's routines seemed trivial compared to the shock of newfound possibility. In the next, the pain of captivity crushed even the brightest hope. Days passed, marked by weather and ration tables, but every glance at the runway, every rumor of another flight, gathered the thread of change that would not be tied off or denied. When the next transport landed, bringing supplies and an unexpected pilot, her hair braided to the collar, sleeves marked by the dust and engine grease of hard work, the prisoners watched not out of politeness, but with the hunger of those who sensed their own story changing. If only just beyond the reach of wire, a line of German nurses stood in the lengthening shadows, staring toward the airfield as another mission finished. Parachute packs were hefted, flight suits dusted clean. Allied women pilots moved steadily through routines, checking radios, sorting manifests, consulting the men with a customary nod or quick word.
The POWs watched every step, aware now of a gulf that was not only national or military but generational, cultural, unimagined before this war.
The pilots bore no signs of condescension.
They simply worked, and in doing so, they shattered the illusion that the sky could ever belong to one kind of person. Within the camp, discussions grew bolder.
At midday, when fatigue made the guards less vigilant and the sun softened the mood, small groups gathered by patched windows. Some women retold family stories, remembered brothers and fathers who vanished over Stalingrad or Normandy. Now, for the first time, the conversation had shifted. It was no longer about what was forbidden or lost, but about what might be possible, or what might be forgiven. Was it defeat alone that made one imagine a changed world? Or was it witnessing its arrival at such an unexpected hour? The Allied pilots, though brief visitors to this scene, held their own private burdens. Their training had been as rigorous as their male peers, but layered with suspicion and exclusion.
Records later showed that for every flight completed, they fought for recognition in reports and pay slips.
Several of these pilots, writing years later,
described delivering planes near camps filled with enemy prisoners, feeling a peculiar mix of pride and sorrow at being admired, envied,
even quietly resented by women who resembled their own sisters and cousins in civilian life on the German side. The change could be measured in small acts of bravery.
A young POW, her nerves sharpened by months of hunger and uncertainty, wrote the story of a pilot she'd seen outside camp. Her movements, her laughter, her boots caked in the same mud as everyone else.
She wrote not only for memory, but for survival. If the war was ending, if the world could indeed be remade, she wanted to be among those who remembered possibility, not just suffering.
Others followed suit, sharing names, tallying details, sketching uniforms and patches in pencil on the backs of scavenged scraps. Tensions remained.
Each new arrival of female pilots brought a spike in anxiety.
Some guards took to extra patrol.
Rumors swirled of saboteurs or propagandists in disguise. In truth, most encounters passed without incident. The spectacle itself did the work. The proof was in the mud, the heavy flight suits, the lingered stares of pilots and prisoners alike.
When night fell and stars blinked through the wire, a strange peace settled.
The sky, stitched with the ghostly hum of lake patrols and distant flak, offered nothing and everything at once. The next morning began as the last had ended, with the battered rhythm of captivity, the never-ending calculation of time and rations.
But something had shifted at the core of the camp.
Even the harshest voices were unable to drown out the swell of questions rising. What stories would these pilots carry home? What stories would the prisoners tell, if they ever had the chance? The horizon that once seemed so final, so impermeable,
now flickered with the sparest signal of change, a contrail traced by courage.
a new future written behind barbed wire. Time in captivity is measured in repetition.
But subtle changes break through more forcefully than any ration drop or escape rumor.
For the German female prisoners, the successive arrivals of Allied women pilots became a steady pulse, a reminder that history was in motion outside the walls.
Over a series of grey, rain-soaked days, as the war wound toward its uneasy close,
The spectacle of women at the controls remained just as shocking.
but it slowly lost its strangeness and began to feel like a message meant as much for hope as for humiliation. Allied routines remained implacable. Crews greeted each new plane with the same efficiency. The pilots exchanging checklists, engines spitting smoke into the spring air. The American and British women conferred in clipped English, sometimes pausing to wave to the knot of prisoners huddled near the wire. Some of the POWs responded, a few even managing a smile amid the chill and mud. One nurse, pulled aside by a senior officer, was quietly praised for calming a younger comrade shaken by the implications of the unexpected guests.
"We're all waiting for something," she whispered. "But maybe some of us are learning to wait for more." Inside the camp, this change grew roots in the most mundane details. Prayers recited each night took on new inflections, no longer just for survival, but for a future no longer so easily divided by gender or nation. In the infirmary, a sickly clerk confided to a physician that she dreamed of travel, perhaps even flight, if peace offered the chance.
She asked about American schools, British pilots, the songs they sang, the books they read.
The doctor answered as best she could, mindful of the guards and the risk that came with every spoken word. The younger women seemed to change first.
Casting of the depthless silence of the defeated for the conspiratorial murmur of those who suspect the world may soon be theirs to shape. Friendship kindled in strange places between those who kept diaries and those who dared to sketch in the margins of Red Cross forms.
A sense of kinship, fragile and new, grew between the POWs and the women on the other side of the fence. Eyes met in moments of mutual recognition, and the lessons of tradition so freshly pressed into service by defeat drifted further away. Not everyone found inspiration in the spectacle.
There were those among the prisoners who drew tighter to tradition, repeating the old lines about a woman's place, about the dangers of ambition, about what was fitting and what would always be forbidden. But their certainty cracked wider with each day the pilots returned.
In the quiet moments after dinner, when candles guttered and the wind rattled loose panes,
stories surfaced of mothers who had defied expectations in smaller ways, of grandmothers who had scraped out meaning from hardship and hope for the Allied command.
The success of these incidents accumulated quietly in forgotten corners of paperwork.
Reports noted improved morale during and after the visits, and there were fewer disciplinary issues among German women in the weeks that followed.
The pilots themselves wrote brief letters home, sometimes mentioning the awkwardness of being paraded, sometimes the pride in demonstrating their mettle to friend and enemy alike.
Their accounts, often both humble and fiercely
candid, would years later
become the seabed for a new understanding of war's possibilities. Word filtered back to the camps through Red Cross,
volunteers and chaplains. Even the officials who had once worried these visits would spark unrest or jealousy now saw only new questions, a ripple of inquiry about the future. If women could ferry bombers and command respect, why not other things long denied? If the law of war could bend to necessity, could other laws bend to justice? The smell of spring brought with it the first green shoots in the prison garden, a plot tended obsessively by a few of the older nurses.
Out in the fields, changes came slower, measured in the labor of clearing debris, fixing fences, and distributing meals whose monotony could not fully blunt what each day now promised, that history,
like the horizon, was closer than ever, and that women who had survived the worst might yet fly, if not away,
then at least toward lives entirely unknown. The weeks rolled onward, and the broader landscape of surrender and occupation changed in ways both public and invisible.
For the German female POWs, the presence of women pilots remained an undercurrent, a secret current beneath daily survival.
The camp's fragile peace held, punctuated by news from the outside, Allied advances through the last redoubts, reports of liberation from Buchenwald and Dachau, rumors of Allied war crimes, freedom,
and Reconstruction mingling together in equal measure. Sometimes,
officers from the American or British auxiliary called on the camp physician to request help with translating, cataloguing, or distributing supplies.
the lines between captor and captive blurred minutely with every innocent question, every shared cigarette, every brief exchange free of suspicion. The pilots appeared intermittently, but were always a spectacle, always fresh proof that the old world was not returning. Some POWs, unable to resist curiosity, pressed the guards, asking if women would be allowed to study in post-war schools, train as doctors, work as engineers.
The guards, themselves uncertain of what peace would mean, shrugged and shifted their weight, eyes on the perimeter dot in the Red Cross tent. Stories travelled faster.
An older POW, motherly in habit, recounted a scene from the fence. Two pilots, their uniforms splattered with oil, laughing at a joke told by a mechanic.
They were just working, she whispered, as if revealing a code. Not performing, not pretending. Working like anyone else, the pilots left behind more than rumor.
One day, as a departing transport lifted off, a slip of paper fluttered to the ground, caught by a gust, just an Allied supply manifest.
But it was picked up, studied reverently by a small group.
Deciphered for its words, for the invisible history it carried inside the barracks.
Transformation was slow and private.
Pride remained, coupled with the ache of loss, but the new generation began to claim space.
Young nurses resolved to apply for foreign study, to write long letters to universities and hospitals abroad when freedom came.
Some practiced English by copying snippets from Red Cross leaflets. Others debated the finer points of flight training, insisting that the right to be brave belonged to anyone who fought for it. The story of the women pilots became ritual, retold every night, a candle of possibility held against the cold, official dark. Civilian life outside the camp changed as well.
Women who had watched captives march through the town now saw planes rise into the sky, mixing the old terror of raids with a new sort of pride.
In homes across Germany, whispered conversations flourished.
Mothers confided in daughters, refusing to let shame over defeat extinguish the chance to seek fulfillment in work, study, or quiet ambition. Letters from the West announced the hiring of women as factory managers, drivers.
Even police clerks, a quiet revolution gathering force far beyond the wire. What lingered longest inside the camp, though, was not defiance or even nostalgia, but the plain realization that history was larger and more forgiving than any rule learned in school or uniform. The pilots were no longer just an Allied curiosity, but a living rebuke to the narrow lessons of the past.
The POWs, especially the youngest, learned to wait for the world to change just enough for hope to pass through the guards. Through the gates, through the horizon at last, across the continent.
The official end of conflict approached.
Newspapers smuggled into the camp described Allied victory celebrations, parades, and new flags unfurling from shattered towers. Newsreels flickered in distant cinemas, showing women in uniforms marching in step, climbing into jeeps, and, for rare moments, clambering into the cockpits of their battered planes.
For the German POWs, hunger and anxiety were constants. But the future no longer felt wholly out of reach.
As if liberation would mean more than simply surrendering old loyalties. On the day the unconditional surrender was broadcast, the camp filled with restless energy.
Allied officers posted notices on mess hall walls, declaring the change in management, the new priorities of peace. Rumors raced from barrack to barrack. Repatriation, prisoner exchanges, the possibility sometimes spoken, sometimes barely whispered that some would be allowed to remain in the West.
To live and work in the countries whose language and customs had become both familiar and strange in captivity.
In the afternoon, a familiar sound drifted through the camp, the drone of engines, the sharper rhythm of boots on the runway.
A final group of women pilots arrived this time. They paused to speak in broken German, answering direct questions from the prisoners.
They described their routes, laughing at memories of bad landings and icy winds, and afraid of confusion or rivalry.
The encounter was brief but burned deep.
Some POWs wept. Some simply recorded the names, the ranks, the stories, determined to remember.
The boundaries of secrecy dropped for a moment. Replaced by the quiet encounter of shared vulnerability was hardest lessons learned not by force, but by witnessing each other's courage. Dinner that night felt different. The guards, mostly quiet, let the prisoners talk freely.
No one spoke of defeat. Instead, people recounted stories from childhood, dreams of travel, ambitions impossible before the world was upended by war. One young nurse described her hope to study medicine in America. Another wrote in a borrowed notebook, as if the page itself might carry her onward. When the wire was finally taken down, time ran forward. In the final days before release, the stories of women pilots multiplied in memory.
Some worried that the promise of change would die with the first failed application, the first rebuke from a father or husband insisting on a return to old ways.
But others knew the world had already shifted. If women could fly above the storm, perhaps they could also choose new destinies within the ruins. The wire was coming down, and with it, the certainty that history was immutable. The airfield grew silent as Allied planes ferried out supplies, gear, and the last crews headed home.
Pilots wrote quick letters to the women in camp, promising to remember them, to advocate for their future in village councils, university halls, and in the first shaky meetings of reconciliation. The POWs, gathering their possessions, understood that not everything would be given easily.
The world ahead was uncertain, full of obstacles and dangers, but for the first time, it was also full of stories of flight, of possibility,
of courage written in the contrails arching overhead with the wire coming down.
Each day marked by the clang of gates and the meticulous shuffling of papers. The German women packed what little they possessed and gathered for processing.
Some were called for transport, given tickets that pointed east toward the battered remains of family homes.
Others, whose records allowed, would be settled as workers in the lands of their former enemies, given the chance to rewrite both name and narrative. In these last hours, the excitement was edged with fear, a question perched on every tongue. Would the world outside live up to the visions and doubts planted in the strange encounters by the fence? The flight crews, finishing their final rotations, stored away maps and switched of radios. Each woman, pilot and prisoner alike, bore her own scars, deep lines at the corners of eyes, hands worked raw by weather and worry, cynicism mixed with the brilliance of hard-won ambition. The pilots saluted as they left, sometimes clasping hands with the prisoners in silent understanding, a hesitant gesture toward a future neither party could clearly describe.
For many, this would be the last flight, the closing chapter of a story written in injuries and resolutions, losses and wins that could not be tallied on ledger sheets. As camp life ended, stories and letters circulated through the displaced populations of a ruined Europe. Some women forged ahead, using contacts and skills acquired in the camps to gain new footholds, rise to leadership in schools, hospitals, and even fledgling political offices.
Others, bound by tradition or circumstance,
returned obediently to family farms or battered apartments,
carrying with them a suppressed ember of what they had seen, a living memory, secret and powerful as any official medal.
Lifelong friendships occasionally formed between former prisoners and Allied pilots, maintained at first through patchwork correspondence and later, for a lucky minority, through actual reunions.
The memory of those aircraft, those impossible flight suits, lingered in conversations for decades, reverberating in the choices and chances seized by the next generation. Official records reflected the change only in dry statistics: new applicants to medical and engineering schools,
an uptick in women's employment in countries once closed or suspicious,
a slow but steady rise in petitions for university admission from women who once wore the insignia of the vanquished, and now sought only a chance to become something more. Historians would one day piece together these incremental shifts, noting the day female POWs glimpsed pilots on the airfield as a strand in the tapestry of post-war reform.
Not only political or economic, but personal, private,
transformative. In the post-war years, as Germany rebuilt itself,
the past was neither rejected nor romanticized. Instead, it became backdrop to a steady, determined advance into new possibilities. Newspapers praised wartime heroines.
Schoolchildren learned the names of the night witches, the wasp, the British ferry pilots. Across Germany, women gathered to study, to vote, to travel. It was not always easy. Defeat and grievance lived alongside ambition. But the sight of women occupying the front lines of possibility, pilots,
yes, but also professors, counselors, scientists became as story mothers told their daughters.
Proof that even from captivity and catastrophe, change could take flight. The narrative, though, was never simple. For every triumph came shadow. Some POWs, denied visas or faced with bureaucracy or prejudice, ended their lives far from the horizons they glimpsed through barbed wire. Others faced towns that would not forget their role in the war, or families unwilling to hear about what had been learned beyond the fence.
Yet, the simple radiance of that moment, the sight of flight suits in sunlight, boots muddy but faces open, Possibility embodied and unafraid remained an indelible memory.
A beacon against the worst that history could impose within the quiet of late evenings. Years or even decades after, the now elderly women remembered. Some kept pressed flower petals from the prison garden. Others preserved letters or old flight logs given surreptitiously through the fence.
They recalled their own awe, the slow dissolution of boundaries, the first moment they allowed themselves to believe that history's narratives,
Like planes, like lives, could be redirected by will rather than written by fate. In the new world, their stories blended with those of the pilots and the guards, the allies and the adversaries, all of them, in ways small and large. Changed forever when women in flight suits walked across the horizon at was end. The wire is rusting now. The runway's silent, grass reclaiming the clay.
but sometimes, when the wind is just right, a passing contrail can catch the light and turn back time not to victory or defeat, but to the instant one world ended and another, uncharted, finally took flight.